Okay, we're now going to move on to some more conceptual registration theory. So, registration is undertaken through an application record, and this application record is a vehicle that conceptually presents a legal instrument, a deed or contract for consideration for registration. Now, we've been through this quote before in an earlier video, but it bears repeating. This is from Reed and Gretton from 2017 in their book Land Registration. In an ideal world, all registration applications would be dealt with instantly on receipt. The register would immediately be altered in accordance with the application, or, in the case of an invalid application, there would be an instant rejection. Items would no sooner arrive in the keeper's in tray than they would leave again. And again, just as a reminder, the keeper is the senior registrar for Registers of Scotland, so this pertains to Scottish law. And in essence, this is describing a digital registration framework where data is presented as part of this whole registration system and can be evaluated immediately, which is a broader context of where we're trying to go. And so an application conceptually proposes a parties' rights land bundle of change. And so all of the parties are agreeing to make changes to rights in land. So the grantor who currently owns, the grantee who will benefit, and the land and rights that demonstrate that relationship. And so let's walk through this again. So here we're looking at the 1019 Le Grand Prix, the exemplar we used in the previous video. So the grantor owns and intends to convey rights to the following grantees. So an ownership right to a new party, and it is the man in black, or Monsieur Noir, who is our grantor, and he is going to dispone to the lady in red, but would like to retain a building restriction and a garden maintenance right. So essentially an exclusive right to building in that area and a garden maintenance right as well. So that is a responsibility, and equally some access to the fishing rights and rights of access over the road, which is shared with Monsieur Bonaparte. And so there is a discussion with a solicitor, and the solicitor prepares a legal instrument. And so it just describes this kind of grantor-grantee relationship to these number of rights that the grantor wants to put forward, and produces an application record which proposes these party right land change bundles. So what we have now is our spatio right bundles. So the ownership right to go to the grantee, the lady in red, the building and garden maintenance that covers this particular spatial extent to remain with the man in black, and the fishing rights and access to go to a cadastral unit. So each of these party right and land elements is articulated as a single change, and that's a delta or transaction. This starts to facilitate the digital transaction process. So the application is submitted. So the legislation and jurisdiction will determine the rejection criteria for an application. So an application is rejected if it satisfies any of this rejection criteria. Otherwise, it must be accepted. An automated or semi-automated logic can be used to verify if a data in the application should be rejected. So if it is rejected, there's no further processing, but it tends to retain that information within the database as part of the archive record, i.e. this was an unsuccessful attempt at registration at this point in time using these criteria, and it failed for these reasons, because there is a very good chance that one of the parties might come back and say, actually, why did you reject that application? I've paid some money to make sure that it goes through. Give me a good reason as to why you rejected it. However, if it is accepted, this data in the application record is now used to formalize the application by registering the legal instrument, providing a legal record of the change to the land register, and articulates the data changes as deltas in the application record against the register. So subordinate right changes reside exclusively in the register itself as spatial parties rights and land data, and any ownership changes are materialized onto the cadastral map. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be this way. This is kind of articulated by specific jurisdiction changes, but we'll go into some of those more flexible elements later on. And a registrable deed formalizes a party right lands change bundle. So here we are, we have our application record, we have our validation logic, and then we see the accepted instrument going through into our register of legal instruments, or register of deeds, in the vast majority of instances. And so our register of legal instruments is a register of accepted registrable legal instruments. And if the supporting legislation is appropriate, then this is effectively a spatial register of legal change, i.e. a long list of acceptable legal change to the register, each of which has been registered by the registrar. So each legal instrument describes specific rights between a granting party and a grantee party over an area of land. It can also represent multiple rights granted to multiple parties over multiple permissible areas of land. Got to bear in mind that the grantor must be able to pass over those rights to the grantee, i.e. you cannot gift what you do not own. And by using spatial reasoning, these rights can describe restrictions and responsibilities. Ownership rights produce the cadastral map, and as much as I say ownership rights, this could also be used for other things which are used to derive titles, such as leases. So theoretically, a cadastral map can be dynamically derived directly from the land register of legal instruments, i.e. the register of deeds. However, some jurisdictions mandate the creation of a cadastral map as a materialized element, as a form of title, as it were. Let's go back to what is a cadastral map. Now, a cadastral map, according to Wikipedia, is a map that shows the boundaries and ownership of land parcels. So really, again, it is really talking about those ownership rights. And in many respects, that cadastral map element is trying to ground things in this materialized chain of title concept that we originally talked about earlier on. And so again, you're seeing this different use of the word title. We'll come back to this later too. So how does this work in practice? So we've got our register of deeds. We find within it that we have our ownership right. And so we extract that one into our cadastral map and materialize it. So here we now have a lady in red owning 1019. But we'll also see that the man in black owns the adjacent property here. Now you can now start to understand why he'd want a building restriction retained against this area here, because he doesn't want the lady in red to build anything over here that overlooks into his garden. He also wants to make sure that there is a responsibility to look after the gardens, because he wants to make sure that when he does overlook her garden, it looks nice and pretty. And so our cadastral map is now materializing that chain of title, which we could have done through deeds. So if we wanted to find out who owned this piece of land, we could just look at what's in the cadastral map to describe the current ownership, because we can believe that it represents the full chain of title going back to the original grantor. That's again a concept we'll come back to later on when we start to talk about title registration. Collectively, the Register of Legal Instruments and Cadastral Map produce a cadaster. We'll move away from Wikipedia now into the International Federation of Surveyors, and they define cadastre as follows. A cadastre is normally a parcel-based and up-to-date land information system containing a record of interests in land, e.g. rights, restrictions and responsibilities. It usually includes a geometric description of land parcels linked to other records, describing the nature of the interests, the ownership or control of those interests, and often the value of the parcel and its improvements. A register of title can be derived from the cadaster. So the cadastral map materializes this register of legal instruments, describes a chain of title, i.e. demonstrating indefeasible ownership, and the subjects, i.e. the set, describing the main plot and other beneficial ownerships. And the register of legal instruments describes subordinate rights that either benefit the subjects, easements, servitudes over other land, or encumber the subjects, i.e. restrictions and responsibilities that are held over the subjects themselves. This represents the first step in this kind of spatially enabled society approach, and that's Rabsford, another element from the FIG initiative in terms of how land administration data can be used more effectively within a social context. And it describes the relationships between the ownership rights and the non-ownership rights. So let's again have a look at that in practice. So here we are with our title derivation process for this 1019 Le Grand Prix. And so initially it's owned by Monsieur Noir. We have our principal ownership extent. We have the benefits. It includes the right of access to the bridges. And we have the encumbrances, which is a right of access for fishing for Monsieur Bonaparte. But that's now an archived version because we've had our new deed come through, which essentially says we have a new owner, and it is the lady in red. There is still the benefit of right of access to the bridges because that wasn't changed in the deed. And there are encumbrances. There's still this right of access to Monsieur Bonaparte, but also the cadastral unit, or rather the owner of the cadastral unit here, can get access to do the fishing. And oh, look, it's the man in black. The man in black owns that cadastral unit. And then there is a building restriction and garden maintenance that is in favour of the man in black, as we discussed earlier. So that is the change to that title from the deed that was submitted. The application itself has a life cycle. You have draft applications, that's applications that are yet to be submitted. You have submitted applications, these are part of the application record pending processing. You have accepted applications, those are processed applications that have been accepted and are still active. These are legal instruments or active legal instruments. And then you have the archive record. Those are processed applications which are no longer or have never been active. So these are accepted ownership, i.e. stuff that's materialized on the cadastral map, or rejected applications, or discharged deeds. But we can see that through the life cycle of the process itself. Okay, thank you for that. We're now going to look at how we deal with operations on the register.